Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we are looking at Ezekiel 28 to 31, and it is in that section of Ezekiel that is focused on other nations, so we're not going to talk much about Judah or Israel, but really we're getting a picture of like geographical, national, world events at this time, because you get the picture that Babylon is just sweeping over and consuming literally everything. Like no one is escaping Babylon. That's what a lot of this chapter about. And a lot of this chapter, these chapters, is about Egypt. I remember thinking when I was younger about Egypt in the Bible, like Egypt pops up a lot. The people of Israel, they accidentally, purposely, now pretty much purposely, they sent their brother there. They sent Joseph there. They sold him into slavery. He ends up there. It ends up preserving them, like the people of Israel are saved
their lives, yep.
because they are living in Egypt. But then they're enslaved because they're living in Egypt. Eventually, they are freed. And there are times when the people want to go back, but God says you're not allowed to go back. There are times when the Israelites used Egypt as an ally in various different conflicts. There's times when the people of Judah used Egypt as an ally in various different conflicts. And then into the New Testament, Jesus actually escapes into Egypt for a time. So Egypt is pretty present in the Bible. And these couple of chapters are very heavily focused on Egypt.
I think before I even start talking about chapter 29, because that's where I really resonated, I think it's really interesting to point out how fickle people can be. There are things that are like so obvious, but back with when we're talking Joseph time, so obvious that God is at work, and like Egypt is like they're friends, like they're almost like brothers working alongside each other, Israel and Egypt. And not too many years later, it's like, well, we liked you, now we don't. We don't remember you, now you're slaves. God's gonna let you go, and it's just like this full circle of just like chasing power. It's so interesting, and people are just so fickle about that kind of stuff. It's very interesting. Because now we read in chapter 29, which is where I resonated, thinking of being a child and hearing about Egypt growing up, like over and over again. Like Egypt was always like the big scary place, like so powerful. And in this chapter, it is talking about how like they are not going to be a problem for God's people in the way that they were ever again. They will never be the strongest nation. They will never be over all of the nations ever again. And I think the people hearing this, they wouldn't have necessarily heard this and been impacted on a very like firsthand basis, because they have heard these stories over and over again of how your ancestors were brought up out of Egypt. I feel like I hear that all the time, and I think they would have heard those stories and resonated that way. But having that peace of knowing that that's never going to happen again, because God is laying it out in the prophecy of Ezekiel here in chapter 29, saying, I will make them so small they will never again rule over the nations. I think that's got to be like, that's got to feel like a sigh of relief for them, knowing that that's not going to ever happen again. But also that, wow, like God's protecting us from the craziness that was Egypt at the time. And that's like the Bible says it, prophecy says it, they're never going to be able to do it again.
I think the thing that stuck out to me as we're reading kind of this sweeping overview of all these nations is how power is so deceitful.
Yeah,
and
that's
how
kind of what I was saying earlier.
All of these places, when they think they're finally the most powerful nation that exists, and they really are, God is always more powerful, and those powerful nations always crumble and fall. And actually, if you really want to get really uncomfortable, throughout all human history, powerful nations always crumble and fall. I mean, you can look at more modern history where major ways that the world has been shaped fell apart. And at this point in time, we're living in like a more calm era, calm period. But every couple of 100 years, there's like a major shift and a major change, and the world is a little bit tumultuous. So you can see in this period of time where Ezekiel is prophesying, the world is very tumultuous because Babylon is just gobbling everybody up. And the interesting thing as we're reading chapter 31 is kind of this image, this allegory of a tree that reaches up and grows higher than the clouds. And that tree that grew above the clouds is supposed to be Assyria. And this is a prophecy for Egypt about how strong and how powerful Syria was. And basically the tree was cut down and destroyed. And God is saying, like, hey, you thought the Assyrians were powerful. You think you're powerful. I destroy all of them. I'm the God of all nations. What I desire to happen will happen. And that's why Babylon is just sweeping in and destroying everything, taking over everything. And if you look at it on a map, like if you want extra credit for the podcast, if you look at just the sweeping size of territory that Babylon is taking over, it's enormous. And it was a empire that was bigger than any empire at that time. It was huge. It was powerful. And that is why there's so much changing and shifting at this time.
Well, it's really crazy too, is like we were talking about the shifting of power. Like Egypt's had it, then like Babylon. Well, actually, there was a time when Israel had it.
Yeah.
Babylon had it.
Yeah.
Eventually, Babylon won't have it either.
Yeah, Babylon's going to fall very soon. Actually, Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians very soon.
Yeah, it's so crazy, and I think that is really humbling that over all humanity, over all history, you can see time after time after time after time, the only one who doesn't change and always has all control and power is always God. And that is just like, doesn't matter what the heck's going on around me, all this crazy stuff that is just like, it makes you uncomfortable in our world today, in our country specifically, just stuff that is going on. Like, man, this is nuts. Like, there's stuff that's way beyond my control, but ultimately, God is beyond all of the control that seems to be overwhelming to me. So that's just, I guess that's comforting, if anything.
I think another interesting correlation is that nations seem to become like prideful and powerful. And when they become prideful and powerful, actually they probably become powerful first and then prideful second, they unhitch from God's design for their nation, from God's design for their people. And they start to just do things that serve themselves. They become selfish. They become arrogant. They become just wicked, like taking advantage of poor people. You saw earlier, like the list of extortion and sacrifice and lying and wickedness. Mm-hmm. Like those things come with power and prosperity. And it's not long after that God's like, no, I'm done with this.
Well, actually, we had read too. I believe, was it in chapter 28? This is still prophecy against Tyre, but there is a whole section in chapter 28, I guess, what is it, verse 2? Yeah, it starts out this little, like, this is what you should say to the prince of Tyre. Because your heart is proud and you have said, I am a god. I sit in the seats of the gods. Like, there's this weird shift that comes with prosperity that you're talking about when, like, you know, having all of these things that you suddenly, like, you put yourself in a new box, even though you really aren't that. You put yourself in this new God box. You're no longer human. You are God. And God pretty much lays it out for him. In verses 8 and 9, not too long later, it says, they shall thrust you down. This is God giving him over to someone else, someone who is going to overcome him. They will thrust you down into the pit, and you shall die the death of the slain in the heart of the seas. Will you say to them, will you still say, I am a god, as they're killing you? No, you won't, because you're not a god. You are simply man. And it's a weird shift of what prosperity and success can do to you to make you feel so invincible.
So, for your part, like, we believe, I would say, in stewardship. There are faithful Christian believers who are very wealthy and very rich. There are faithful Christian believers who are pretty poor and not rich. What we believe is that stewardship means you have whatever God has given you. Everything you have is because God allowed you to have it. Mm-hmm. And so we must wisely and faithfully use what God has given to us for God's glory so that we don't become prideful and we don't become arrogant and we don't start to believe that we're outside of God's rule and God's wrath. Mm-hmm. And so I just encourage you to find your faith in God. Do like an inventory of your life. Do you believe that you have what you have because God allowed you to have it, or because you brought it on yourself? Mm-hmm. And if you are starting to feel like you achieved it because you brought it on for yourself, you're in a dangerous place. Yeah. You might not be in like full-blown disaster mode. You just might need a couple little adjustments. But my invitation to you today is to actually think through those things. And it's sort of a reach to say that's application from Ezekiel 28 to 31. But that is what these nations did. They found pride in their possessions, in their power, in their renown, and God laid them low because of it. So be humble. Know that God has blessed you with the things that you've been able to have, and worship the Lord and not the things. So we'll be back again tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplанyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.